Back in 1986, when Brian Roach was just 19 years old, he ran for mayor of a town called Minco, Oklahoma, and he would win the election by 8 votes. Just a decade and a half later, he would find himself in bed, bleeding to death following a brutal stabbing dealt by the hand of his own mother-in-law. Although poor Brian Roach would lay audibly pleading for his life, not just the mother-in-law, but also his wife and his own 2 daughters would all let him bleed to death in his own very bed. This is what unfolded on this particularly strange and fateful night in February of 2001. The Roach residence in Minco, a town with a population of about 1,400 people located roughly 30 miles from Oklahoma City, was occupied by Brian Roach, his wife, Tammy Sue Roach, and the couple's 2 daughters, ages 10 and 15. Tammy's own mother, Carol Sue Elvaker, was also present in the home that evening, although it's unclear whether she lived there too, or else if she had just swung by for a late-night visit. Either way, what is clear is that while Brian snoozed away in his bedroom, the 4 ladies weren't feeling ready to turn in just yet, and so they did what any other family would be inclined to do on a boring night in Grady County. That is, they pulled out the dusty old Ouija board and the 4 of them excitedly went to town. Except, it wouldn't take too long before shit took a turn for the ugly. You might actually say, the horrifying. At once, as they played around, asking the board questions and then letting the planchette do its thing, suddenly, the grandmother, Carol, felt a message coming through the board. It was a message sent to her from God, who in essence informed her that Brian, her slumbering son-in-law, was evil, and furthermore, she would need to kill him. Choosing to ignore orders from a game or even from an otherworldly spirit would have been one thing, but to not follow an order from God was out of the question for the 53-year-old grandmother. Likely not wanting to try her luck against the almighty ruler of heaven and earth, Carol got up out of her seat, grabbed a big knife, went to Brian's room, and stabbed him 1 time in the chest while he slept. She then is said to have tried turning the knife on her own 10-year-old granddaughter, and although it isn't clear whether God commanded this too, or else if this was Carol's own idea, we do know it was due to the belief that her father's evil had somehow rubbed off on the child. Lucky for everyone, her attempt to harm the little girl was unsuccessful, and after this, Tammy would hide the knife. Even more strangely, as Brian lay there still alive and shouting for somebody to please come help him rather than phone for an ambulance, all 4 females would next pile into the car and leave the residence, Brian presumably still dying back at the house, if he hadn't just barely perished already. Strangely, the one they've all entrusted to do the driving tonight is none other than Carol Elvaker, the woman who literally just stabbed these girls' husband and father to death because God commanded her to do so, and who then literally just tried to stab her 10-year-old granddaughter, the same granddaughter sitting in the car with them right now. This is the person they're letting drive them to God even knows where, as opposed to, say, I don't know, maybe dialing 911. But, at any rate, with crazy old Carol behind the wheel, the vehicle zips onto the I-44, headed toward Tulsa. Now, it's later said that family members attest to the fact that prior to this, Carol had 0 history of mental illness. She'd never displayed any odd behavior, and she hadn't, of course, been drinking or drugging on the night in question. I'm personally starting to wonder if maybe that Ouija board wasn't cursed after all, because it seems like getting into a motor vehicle with this woman who has obviously just snapped is a pretty crazy thing to do. And thus, it's no shocker at all that Carol soon decides to crash their vehicle into a road sign. This time, in attempt to kill them all. And, when her messed-up plan fails, well, she takes one last opportunity to try and push her own 15-year-old granddaughter into traffic as the teen girl is trying to flee. All 4 have at least some minor injuries from the accident, but Carol has actually shattered both of her ankles. This doesn't seem to faze the woman a bit, however, as evidenced by the fact that after she pauses only as long as it takes to strip off all her clothes, she leaps over the freeway median and goes darting into the woods north of the interstate. This is where police end up finding her hours after the incident. Carol Sue Elvaker, would be charged with first-degree murder after first being treated at a hospital. Her daughter, Tammy Roach, would also be brought into custody not too long after and charged with being an accessory to murder as well as enabling child abuse. Tammy would plead guilty to the child abuse charge. The former charge would be dropped. Brett Burns, assistant district attorney, came to issue the following statement regarding the case.
It's amazing how the grandmother was able to let this Ouija board consume her life, and how she was able to brainwash her daughter and granddaughters.
Unlike perhaps her family members, Carol Sue Elvaker would not be able to fool the system. Determined to be insane rather than chosen by God to kill, Carol was subsequently found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to an insane asylum for a yet-to-be-determined period of time. In 1995, in the Mayfair district of London, there lived a 20-year-old Satan worshipper named David McCallum. It is said that his entire bedroom was a shrine to his lord, Lucifer. The walls were covered with posters of the devil and other various images depicting human torture and sacrificial rituals. David, who also idolized Charles Manson, appeared to be an avid collector of Charles Manson-related magazines and other media. Naturally a lover of heavy metal music, David decorated his floors with lyrics of his favorite heavy metal songs. He had also brazenly carved a pentagram onto the side of a TV, right next to the words, Devilman Killer, 666. But of course, nothing did justice to the focal piece of the room, a dark altar draped in a sheet of black satin and candles sitting atop of it. Then, at the foot of the altar, David displayed one of his most prized possessions, his Ouija board. By the way, he would later explain, it sounded as if David would consult the almighty Ouija on rather frequent occasion, and he would dutifully heed its instruction, regardless of how twisted or warped. For example, the Ouija board had once told David to go out and buy himself a combat knife, which he did. He would subsequently use the knife to perform animal sacrifices on his altar. A few days before Christmas, in 1995, David and a friend were out wandering the streets of London when they ran into a pair of younger 15-year-old boys. It's said that the younger lads, who introduced themselves as Michael Earridge and Stephen Curran, felt flattered to be getting attention from the older pair of boys. And so, when David extended an invitation for them all to go back to his place to listen to heavy metal music and watch music videos, the boys would quickly accept. Except that the younger boys would be in for quite the shock once they entered David's home and got a good look around. Some might even say that the boys began to feel rather afraid at the sight of the wall-to-wall murder-themed demonic paraphernalia. To top things off, there, in the middle of David's bedroom, was the altar, looking almost as if it had been waiting. Big candles were lit, and David's Ouija board sat there, prominently displayed. It's said that David gestured toward the board with a frightening smile plastered on his face. The younger duo practically trembled as they approached David, his buddy, and the ominous board. In spite of the dread they were both feeling, young Michael and Stephen both felt they had little choice but to participate in whatever it was the older, cooler boys threw at them. And so, the four youths would proceed to take a seat on the floor around the board. David, who it soon became clear was the leader of this little group, as well as this elaborate ritual, would be the first to speak. Using a glass in lieu of a planchette, David proceeded with an attempt to invoke none other than his master, Satan himself. At one point, David would ask of the board,
"If you are Satan, what do you want me to do?"
To which the board replied under no ambiguous terms,
"Kill."
Without hesitation, David's friend, who was also being referred to as David's apprentice, lunged forward, grabbing Michael's hand and placing it onto the glass. Perhaps seeing the younger boy's fear and even feeling his resistance, the so-called apprentice next threatened that if Michael didn't do as told, then he would chop off his finger. At this point, Michael stated out loud that he was scared, and he said that he wanted to go home, to which the apprentice would reply,
"You are not going anywhere until I have done my master's will."
Poor Stephen, who had so far been watching this strange scene unfold before him, as if he were experiencing some strange and silly, albeit terrifying nightmare, would next be forced to sit and watch his friend, Michael, get knocked on the head, after which David dragged him over and placed him onto his bed. Stefan continued to watch in horror as David busted out his foot-long knife and started stabbing Michael repeatedly. The older boy would only stop when at last he heard the apprentice say,
"Stop now, David. You can calm. He's dead now."
In the end, Michael had been stabbed a total of 11 times, and he was indeed dead. The sacrifice complete, David and his apprentice would force a trembling young Stefan to touch the handle of the knife. They said that this was so his fingerprints would be on it too, should the boy get any bright ideas about telling anyone about what he'd witnessed. They then wrapped Michael's lifeless body up in some bedding before dumping him between floors 7 and 8 of the flats at which David lived. It's said the demon-worshipping duo intended to dispose of the body at a landfill later on, but would never get the chance. Because even though they had released Stefan with a stern warning not to tell a soul, Stefan would not hesitate to go straight to the authorities with every last twisted detail of what he had just seen. When cops came to arrest David McCallum, word had it he grinned widely as he uttered just one word:
Guilty.
Since David would continue to smile even long after, this would prompt police officers to ask him why he was smiling so much, to which David would chillingly reply,
I'm still buzzing from earlier.
When questioned about the murder, David told authorities that the Ouija board had instructed him to kill Michael, and oddly enough, he seemed to believe his own baloney. As he would tell interrogators,
All of a sudden, I started attacking him. A voice in my head said, Kill him!
Furthermore,
The Ouija board told me to buy the knife, and the demon madness told me to kill him. The board spelled out the words, kill.
also, David boasted, he had sacrificed 2 frogs to so-called demon madness the prior year. In court, David would plead guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, or, as they say in the U.S., due to insanity. It's been noted that he grinned throughout every court appearance he made. Concluding a psychiatric examination, David would in fact be diagnosed with schizophrenia and sent to live at Broadmoor, one of England's oldest and best-known high-security psychiatric hospitals, known for housing some of England's most notorious offenders. In July of 1933, Dorothea Irene Turley, her husband Ernest J. Turley, their 14-year-old daughter Mattie, and 13-year-old son David went to live at the Crossbar Ranch in Apache County, Arizona. Before long, the Turleys made friends with the Pierce family, who lived nearby. Dorothy, in particular, hit it off with Kent Pierce, the Pierce's eldest son, and they would soon start to go on little excursions together. Dorothy's daughter Mattie and Pollard Wiltbank, another friend, would usually accompany Dorothy and cowboy Kent on these frequent outings. As relaxing as these pleasure trips were, however, the Turleys would naturally need to become adjusted to life around their new home as well. Daughter Mattie was known to help her dad with the chores around the ranch, whereas, with her mother, Mattie and her mother preferred to pass time with a decidedly more indoor activity. Specifically, Mattie and her mother would often mess around with Dorothy's newly acquired Ouija board. While nowadays, some consider the Ouija board a way of summoning spirits, conversing with the dead, and running the risk of opening a portal through which demons may enter, others consider it nothing more than a silly game. Young Mattie happened to fall into the former category, as she'd always been taught by her own mother, who appeared to trust in its mystical powers and was known to consult it for all sorts of reasons. At any rate, it was during one of these sessions, on November 8, 1933 to be exact, as Mattie and her mother sat, fingertips poised on the planchette, as they'd done many times before, that the board would take on a strikingly different and frightening personality. Because at one point during their session, the board would take it upon itself to spell out the following chilling phrase, "Daddy must die." Horrified, they asked the board who was going to kill him. It replied by spelling out the letters M.T., which they interpreted to stand for Mattie Turley. The 14-year-old girl, soon to be 15 in December, was obviously shaken. But she held faith that the Ouija, a powerful oracle, would only issue commands that must necessarily be obeyed. It wasn't until about 1 week and a half later that Mattie got her opportunity to carry out the board's orders. It was November 17th, the night before her little brother's birthday, that a skunk made its way underneath the Turleys' home. All night long, the unscrupulous little menace kept the family up with its noisy exploring and its foul stench. The next day, when Dorothea decided to take David out with her to go buy what they needed for that night's celebratory dinner, Mattie would stay home with her father under the pretense of helping him try to catch the unwanted occupant beneath their home. Apparently, back in those times, it was not unusual for a 14-year-old girl to own her own shotgun, and so no one thought it strange for her to bring her gun along when she accompanied her father to go milk the family cow. On their way back to the ranch, Mattie followed behind her dad, still lugging along that loaded double-barrel shotgun of hers. Should she happen to see that skunk, I suppose, she would have been literally armed and ready. At one point, as they walked, 2 shots rung out. Ernest had been shot. Perhaps, naturally assuming it had all been an accident, he scolded his daughter by saying, "You should be more careful. Let this be a lesson to you." He then told her to go get help, which she at once ran and did. As it happened, Dorothy and David had just been getting home when they ran into a panicked Mattie, who told them she had tripped, and in the process of doing so, she had accidentally shot her own father. Dorothy and the young cowboy neighbor, Kent Pierce, would sit by Ernest and help to tend to his wounds while everyone waited for the authorities to arrive. When the cops did finally get there, Mattie gave them the same story she had told her mom and brother, i.e., that it had all happened by accident. One of the officers, however, felt that Mattie's story was suspicious. The bullets had entered and traveled through Ernest's body downwards. To him, it appeared as if the gun had been shot from shoulder height, and the officer voiced this inconsistency to Mattie. At this point, the 14-year-old girl broke down and she told them the truth. She had shot him deliberately, she confessed, except that her motive would leave everyone stunned. In essence, young Mattie would tell investigators all about how, quote-unquote, the Ouija board made her do it. When pressed for more detail, she would tell them exactly how it had gone down. It was less than 2 weeks ago that Mattie and her mother, Dorothea, had sat to play with the mother's board, as they every so often did. Except today, the board would spell out a horrifying message: "Daddy must die." When asked the question as to who would kill Mattie's father, the response came back, MT, which, Dorothy pointed out to Mattie, must stand for Mattie Turley. Mattie would testify that she became frightened, but that her mother urged her to do what the board said. As Mattie herself explained,
"I asked Mother if I had to do what the Ouija board said, and she told me there was no escaping its command."
Mattie also added that
"Mother told me that the Ouija board could not be denied and that I would not even be arrested for doing it."
Mattie explained how she had stayed home that afternoon so that she could be alone with her dad, but that this was, as per her mother's suggestion. She added that when it came to the actual shooting, she had nearly lost her nerve, but she regained her courage upon recalling how much it would mean to her mom. Once again, in Mattie's own words,
"I remembered how important it was to Mother to marry her handsome cowboy, so I raised the gun quickly and shot both barrels."
What was this about a handsome cowboy? Police officers naturally wanted to know. As it turned out, the relationship that the 39-year-old former beauty queen Dorothea Turley had formed with the 22-year-old neighbor and cowboy Kent Pierce had crossed over into more than just friends territory. Mattie herself had witnessed her mother and her so-called cowboy be affectionate to each other on several of the outings they would take around the countryside. In fact, it was said that Dorothy spoke quite frequently of her plans to marry her handsome cowboy, her father, of course, being the only thing that stood in her way. Upon learning about Mattie's confession, Dorothea naturally flipped out. She started to claim that the police had mistreated Mattie, and that's what had pushed her into saying all that she'd said. Except that Mattie stuck her ground. She insisted that no, the cops had not mistreated her, but that she'd merely told the truth, adding that she'd simply thought it was the right thing to do. On December 22, 1933, the same month that Mattie turned 15 years old, she pled guilty to a charge of attempted murder, seeing that her father appeared as if he would possibly pull through. The teen girl was described as being very much broken up by all that had happened, and in the end, the county attorney put in a recommendation that she be sent to serve a sentence of 6 years at the state school for girls. Only 4 days later, on December 26, 1933, Mattie's father, Ernest, finally died as the result of the wounds inflicted upon him by his own daughter, Mattie. It's said that prior to Mattie being shipped off to the girls' school, where she'd been sentenced to serve out her time, her own mother's last words to her were, spoken in a sarcastic tone of voice,
"I thank you for your cooperation. Be a good girl."
And yet this wouldn't be the end of it. It was undeniable what Dorothea had done in terms of trying to get her very own daughter to take the blame for her own sordid plans. In the end, Dorothea too would stand trial, and now, since her husband's passing on December the 26th, she was facing charges of murder. Although Dorothy would maintain her innocence, insisting that Mattie had been coerced into a false confession and that the shooting had indeed been accidental, the court heard a lot of damning testimony against the aging cougar. There was, for one, all that Mattie had said about hearing her mother constantly gush about hoping to soon marry her dashing 22-year-old cowboy. But there were plenty of people to corroborate the daughter's claims as well. One neighbor, another woman, testified their Dorothy would often talk of one day marrying her cowboy, and Pollard Wiltbank, who had often accompanied Dorothy, Kent, and Mattie on their excursions, testified that Dorothy and Kent spent most of the time in each other's arms. Others, too, would come out with claims of having heard Dorothy openly brag about the good times she would have while out on the mesa with Kent Pierce late at night, how she was in love with Kent, and how, on one occasion, she'd even threatened to kill her husband, Ernest, to his very face. After deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict against Dorothea, and she would be sentenced to either 20 or 25 years, depending on which source one chooses to believe. Astonishingly enough, after serving just 2 years of her 20-some-year sentence, Dorothea would be granted a second trial, and then, due to some other technicality, on September 12, 1936, she would be acquitted, finding herself a free woman again, just like that. As the story goes, one of the first things Dorothy did was to locate Mattie, in the hopes of coercing her daughter to come live with her back east. Mattie agreed to meet with her mother only once, but that turned out to be only for the purpose of telling Dorothy that she never wanted to see her again.